Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 300 of my modded Factorio playthrough. Since this is a special milestone, I wanted to do something a little special for the episode. I know I typically don't do that kind of thing, but a couple of you did ask for a factory tour episode, and that actually seems to make a lot of sense, because part of the point of doing this playthrough for me was to not do a factory tour type playthrough, but actually show the entire process of how you build something this big. But that does lead to the problem of some things may have been built very long time ago, and you may either not have been there when it was built, like this tree setup, or it was literally 250 episodes ago and you just don't remember, because I mean, I can barely remember. I'm the one who built it. So it seems pretty smart that every once in a while there should be an episode to just kind of review the factory, both for newcomers and also just existing viewers of the series, just to catch up on what everything is, basically. So hopefully this doesn't take like 2 hours. That's kind of my fear. So there's a lot here, so I don't know exactly how much and how in depth I should be talking about these things. But all ore processing starts with the standard ores, and with angels there are 6, where you have sapphirite, givelite, steatite, crotinium. The red over there is rubite, and then bonmodium at the end. And they come from, hello train, white circuit boards. They come from wherever, some of them are like right here, and other ones get delivered from other places. So this train looks like it's empty, but it's not. It's just the ores are coming from somewhere else. So they pick up their ores from wherever. They have an extra car on the back that has the relevant acids necessary for infinite mining. And that can actually be pretty deep. Like this rubite mine right here, this tiny little thing, has been here almost since the beginning. Like, it's been mined a very long time. And you see this one mine right here has 167,000 rubite on it, plus the 5.7 per second. So there's definitely a lot of resources if you're willing to mine them slower and with acid. So each train has its acid on the back just in case its mine requires it. And then it has to go through the different stages of processing the ores. And there are 4 stages, or 4 tiers in total. I have up to tier 3 done here. Where the first tier is you take the ore and you crush it down, giving you some amount of crushed stone, and the rest of it just goes down. So these belts look full, but it's kind of by design. It's a little weird, but we were kind of bus limited at the time. Not anymore since we have blue belts, but basically, the extra stone is being dumped into making slag slurry, which then goes into other processes. And stone processing in itself is a very complicated subject for the factory, and it's probably what makes Tier 2 ore refining take so long and so hard, and it's one of those things that just makes you want to rage quit playing Angel Bobs, is because the amount of work that goes into it. Like, so this is the ore sorting. This is up to Tier 3 ores right here. And it's basically 1 red belt of each tier of each color. So that's a lot of ore. Whereas all of this right here, this craziness, is all of the stone processing aspect of it. So the stone processing is actually a lot harder. But it sends it down to stone processing, and then it has essentially 4 belts of ore. One of them is getting bypassed to go down here. The other 3 are going up. And of the 3 that's going up, 1 gets bypassed, and 2 other ones go into Tier 2 and Tier 3. So we have 1 belt of bypass and then 2 belts going in to make the Tier 2 of the ore. And it creates 2 belts. 1 belt goes to the bus, and then the other one gets bypassed to go to Tier 3. And Tier 2 is the most complicated one, where you have the ore that goes in, and then purified water, and then you get the ore, the wastewater, and then these geodes that come out. So it's a lot of junk that goes in and out, so it just makes it kind of difficult. And then the other 2 tiers are a little easier, where Tier 3, you just add the acid to get the crystals. In Tier 4, you add nothing, you just have to spend time to do it. So to avoid having to send all of these crystals on a bus, they're just being directly chopped up right here because this is what they would be used for. And then they're getting turned into crystal slurry, and that's also getting sent to the stone processing. The wastewaters have several different outputs. One of them is to take the wastewater and basically get the acid component out of it, plus either mineralized water or saline water, and some amount of purified water remaining. And these are set to a logic because if the factory becomes overloaded on acid, then these would clog up. So they are set to turn off if the factory doesn't actually need acid components. So right now they're swinging because we do need it, and we're actually kind of low on fluorite, so it makes sense why these ones are going in particular. And then if they are full, or just to make up for what they can't cover, we have other water purifiers just making the purified water right here. And down here at the bottom are the clarifiers, and it's interesting that they're running because they basically would run if it can't process the wastewater fast enough. And it should. So I can kind of see right here, it's kind of funny just in explaining how the factory works, I kind of notice a problem where it cannot get rid of the mineralized water fast enough from up here. So it would probably need to have some kind of pump in there, but that's a fix for another day. Because this is a factory tour video, not a fix stuff video. But, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just want to save what you can, and that's kind of what all this is. And this is mirrored 6 times for each resource. Exactly which resources go in and out are different, but the concepts are the same. And we'll cover the ore mixtures in a second here. So each ore that comes out goes into a storage warehouse here, and it's being used as logic. So each one of these nominally will be set to 1,000 ore. And that will make sense in a bit, because that will allow us to have priority on which ores go where. And then off to the side here, we have the ore mixtures. So those other bypasses of the crushed ores go in, and then they get turned into the tier 1 of ore mixtures, where you just mix 3 colors together to get the ferrous and cupric mixtures. 2 belts go by to go on the bus, and then 4 more go into the system for tier 2. And tier 2 requires that you grind them down with a milling drum, and lubricant gets added to those milling drums. And then 2 of those belts go by while 2 of the other belts continue onwards, and then they get mixed with a little bit of tier 2 of the other ores. So it's a lot of ingredients, 6 ingredients into this, including thermal water and sulfuric acid to get the sludge. And then the sludge can be filtered with sodium hydroxide to get the dust, which is tier 3, and some wastewater. And then this setup on the side here is basically just a sodium hydroxide generator by electrolyzing saline water, just for basically belt reasons. Now that we have faster belts, we may not actually need this setup anymore, but that's kind of why it's there. And then all of this stuff gets put on our ore bus. And we have 6 belts for tier 1, 6 belts for tier 2, 6 belts for tier 3, an empty spot for 6 belts of tier 4. And then we have the first 3 tiers of the ore mixtures, plus the catalysts, and some empty belts. And then we have all of our ore sorting machines. And I'll kind of explain how that works, but there's basically 2 controls for these ore sorters, where we control it on the bottom based on input resources. So basically we're looking at, well, we only have so much, let's say, rubite, and we are capable of using more rubite than we can produce. It's just how it is. There's no point in having all of this perfectly balanced with this, because each one of these setups runs at different times and is good for different things. So my thought process here is, instead of trying to have a perfect setup, I put every available process type up and then use logic to control which ones turn on and which ones turn off. And this is actually a a theory that I use with the rest of the factory in general, where when you get better tiers of processing, still process the original tier, because usually the higher tiers require more conditions to be right for that tier to work properly. So the higher the tier, the more things that can go wrong and cause your factory to stop working. So if you have all of the previous tiers, then when the better tiers can't work, the previous ones can act as backups. So it's controlled based on the input and based on the output. And that might seem kind of weird, but the idea is, like, let's say with silicon, that our factory's need of silicon isn't necessarily linked with its ability to create silicon. Many times they are, but also sometimes they're not. So just because we can create silicon doesn't mean we need it, and just because we need it doesn't mean we can make it. So having logic on both sides allows two different conditions to be correct for any given thing to actually operate. And the stuff at the beginning has very little logic attached to it because it only works under a certain condition. Like copper works if it's under 32,000. So you can see how copper is coming from other sources and it's getting sorted in here, but it's not enough. So you see the levels going down, and then when it does go down, the best way of running it does run just to get it above and pulse like that. But we're not actually using copper as fast as we could use it. So if copper was running at full blast, we'd have 4 belts going out, but only 2 going in. So the other 2 would have to come from worse processes. And to see kind of how it works, we can go down to the very end of this, where there are more controls, and also more colors, like right here. But the way it works is the resources come in, and these are other sources, like these ores are coming in from the crystallizers, which is in stone processing, and these ores are coming in from the byproducts of making science. And they just get injected in the bus, and the way the ore bus works is every time it gets to its control warehouse, anything that's on the bus gets pulled off and put into the warehouse, and anything that isn't part of that keeps going down the chain. And to make things a little simpler, on the lines that actually make the item, you can't really see it because it's kind of hard to see there, but like cobalt is being bypassed, so it's not creating cobalt here, putting it on the bus, and then taking it off again. It's actually going underneath. And that applies for everything else. So there's some lights here that kind of show the on and off conditions, where red lights are for off conditions, or in other words, a given resource is overloaded, you can't make this resource. And green lights are, if the conditions were right, please run it. So we can use cobalt here, where the one on the left, it has a green light, so basically cobalt is being turned on because it's at 0, and nothing is turning it off, so it's allowed to go. Where this other method, also cobalt, it has a green light, but it has a red one, and it's being turned off because I was thinking it would be manganese, but it's probably not that. Looks like it's nickel is overloaded. So the way this logic works is that anytime a warehouse gets too full, and most of the time with the factory it's been nickel, anytime it gets too full, which is above 80,000, every method that produces nickel turns off, because we just can't make any more because this warehouse is almost full. So it doesn't matter how badly we need to make the resource that creates nickel, we just can't. It's just not an option, so it turns it off. And the way that works is, let's say a desired method, or a good method, air quotes, makes nickel. Well, now that it can't run, a less desired method may turn on. So these numbers, it's pretty much an episode in itself. And I have a few episodes, I think, talking about how I came up with all these control numbers. But the idea is each setup has its own priority. So there's more desirable methods and there's less desirable methods, and you turn them on and off based on how low a warehouse gets. So when the warehouse gets lower and lower, the less and less desirable methods turn on until it basically gets to 0, when every single method will turn on no matter how bad it is, because you're that low. So every setup has basically 2 controls, one on the top and one on the bottom. So I've explained how the one on the top goes. But the way the ones on the bottom go is they look at those storage warehouses above the tier 3 sorting. So with sapphirite chunks here, to sort it in the general way, we have to have at least 500 sapphirite chunks in its warehouse. And because we do, it would run. And nominally, all these would stay around 1,000, but that won't necessarily always be the case. And because you can't perfectly predict what the factory is going to do in the future, it's better just to prepare for it the best you can. And this system only works if the output belts are faster than the input belts. So when I first built this, the problem is it was red belts on the bus and a red belt going in. So if 30 units go in and 30 go out, then the logic doesn't work. So the output actually has to be faster. So now that they're blue, it is working correctly. And each of these setups is also set on priority based on which one's the more desired resource. So when it comes to those sapphirite chunks, the other one was above 500. But to make our nickel here, there are no conditions, at least for sapphirite. So in other words, this is the best method of using sapphirite, so it always runs. The other condition is rubite has to be above 300. So each one of these has their own combinations. And the various sorting methods are iron, copper, lead, and tin, which use mixtures of tier 1 and these mineral catalysts. And then this method is using the tier 1 of the ore mixtures to make manganese and some other stuff. And then tier 2 of the ores plus these crystal catalysts here get mixed in to make nickel, silicon, aluminum, zinc, and silver. And just because of the positioning of things, this is where the generic sorting type works, and that's the kind where the ore goes in, you get some ore out, and then you get slag, which is just junk. Although it's very useful junk. And then it gets sent to stone processing. And right here is the tier 2 of the ore mixtures. And then the normal sorting of tier 2 for the different ores. This is a way just to make fluorite directly. And it's kind of weird, but you mix the ferrous powder with the givelite chunks to get it. And then this is our tier 3. And because we're in the process of working on it, but haven't quite upgraded this yet, all we have access to is the tier 3 chunk sorting. So it makes a bunch of stuff and gives you slag as a result. But the problem here, like with cobalt, is that we only need the cobalt, but we have to make the slag, the iron, the copper, the aluminum, and the zinc to get that one piece of cobalt. So it's kind of inefficient in that sense. We're not wasting materials because we're not destroying these other resources, so they're going into their necessary warehouses and getting used eventually. But, you know, if you're not using them, they will fill up to 80% and then they get shut off. So our output of cobalt has been perpetually limited. In fact, all 3 of these are limited because of that. And there's not much you can do until you get better sorting methods. And that's how the ore sorting works. There's some logic here, but this is just being used as test conditions for these warehouses. And we don't really use them anymore, but when this was built, we were using this to enable and disable the different warehouses, just to make sure that they all worked. And that was quite a lot of talking for this section of the factory when there's all of this. So I don't know, is this going to be a 2-hour episode? Maybe. But this is also kind of the most complicated part of Angel Bob's. It's just the ore sorting part, or the ore processing anyway. And it's basically in 3 steps. One is the ore sorting step, is what I have explained here. It's where you end up with the, I call them like standard Factorio ores, but in other words, just ores on belts. Like, it's a little weird when you're looking at like zinc, but, you know, iron and copper, stuff like that. The second step is probably the easiest one, but that's when you process those ores into ingots to gain higher efficiencies. And then the third step is turning those ingots into the actual plates. And it might seem kind of weird to put these into 3 steps, especially since the last step seems so small by comparison. But the reason is that these setups are kind of not directly connected to each other. I mean, definitely making the ingots is, because it's kind of a straight line, but each one of these setups is different from each other. So you can't just assume they'll all be the exact same size and fit nicely next to each other, compared to ore sorting, which they all kind of are basically the same size and fit nicely next to each other. And then the last step is separate because it has an ingot bus, because you can use ingots in different combinations. So it's not necessarily a straight line. And you could do it a straight line where it's, you know, you make copper, it goes up here, it goes in here. But that would be a very specific setup, and all it could do is make copper. And I wanted to try to build this factory to be not very specific, where it can do lots of things. So each one of these ore processing setups is different. I'm not going to talk about every single one, but I'll give you an idea. There's essentially 3 tiers of it. The 3rd tier has the most steps. So what happens when you process the ores is if you just directly process it from the standard ore into an ingot, it's basically a 1-to-1 ratio, so you get nothing extra out of it. If you process it into tier 2, you get a 50% increase. So if you put in, 100 of the ore, you would get 150 ore out of it. And then tier 2, you would get a 100% increase. So 100 ore goes in and 200 ore would come out. So the first step is basically turning it into the processed version. And then the second step is turning it into the pellet version. And then at some point you have to convert this into the ingots, and different setups have different numbers of intermediate steps. So just the example of copper here is the pellets go in, you add oxygen, and this is a blast furnace, so it needs a fuel, and then it gives you the anodes. And then those anodes get mixed in with sulfuric acid to make the ingots. And then those ingots get jammed on the bus. And this particular setup can make 8 belts of copper ore. And the reason why I can do that is because it has 4 belts going in. So because it's a 100% increase in efficiency, 4 belts go in and 8 will come out. So that's kind of like how powerful these setups can be. So you definitely want to do them if you can. And there's one for each individual setup. You only unlock the higher tiers of the better resources near the end. So like with nickel, for example, we only can do the tier 2. So we process it into the processed ore, and then that goes into these plants to make the anodes by mixing in the sulfuric acid, and then it gets turned into the ingots. And other setups work differently, like with aluminum. You process it, and then you mix in the sodium hydroxide, and then it makes alumina, which then gets made into the ingots. So each setup is surprisingly different from each other, and it's kind of interesting like that, where it's not just a direct copy. And some of these look real dumb, but it's because I try to want to use the same amount of space, where like with gold, the gold goes in, it just goes into a blast furnace and ingots come out. So this is what tier 1 looks like. It's hilariously simple. Tier 1 gold compared to, like tier 3 of the manganese, where all the steps it has to go through. And then after that, it gets put on the ore bus. And there's also 3 different tiers of the way that you can make the plates themselves. So then the first tier is the ingots get melted down in the induction furnace and turned into liquid, and then they go through a casting machine to make the plates. And with the alloys, like cobalt steel and Invar here, it's the only way to make them. And then tier 2, you get the option of making coils, where you still melt them down, but now you add water to make them in a coil form, and the coil form is 4 times as dense as the original plate form. So it's really good logistically. And the disadvantage to doing this is, I call them plate choppers, but you can't just use the coils. You have to chop those coils first, back into plates, so then you can put them into the assembly machine. So it's an extra step. But those choppers can use productivity modules. So that's really nice. You can also use productivity modules on these plate machines here as well, but it ends up being a much bigger setup. But coils are still better because they're denser and easier to ship. But beyond just the regular setup here, there's an additional tier that is much more compact, that requires the use of coolant instead of water. So you put the fresh coolant in, it becomes used dirty coolant, which must be cooled down in cooling towers, which does give you some steam that you can get some free power out of. And then you have to clean the coolant to put it back into the machines, but also it wastes some, so you also have to inject some from your factory into it, so it does consume some coolant in this process. But the advantage is it's so much faster. So if you look here, these 6 machines are filling up 2 red belts, so they're basically doing 10 a second. When you compare to some of these older setups, for example with aluminum, where we have all of these to make 1 red belt, and it might not actually be 1 red belt, we'll have to check. It is. It's been balanced. So it's much faster and smaller to do the tier 3 here with coolant. And then after that, it basically just gets put into a warehouse for LTN to make a trade request for it eventually. And there's some outliers here, like to make steel, you have to take regular iron ingots first, and then they get converted into steel. And then that gets put on the bus. You can make steel directly, but you can also mix it in with other things. So each one of these has its own little setup, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but like when it comes to steel, the reason why this ingot bus exists is because there's so many different ways of making steel. So you see here, if we just wanted to use steel ingots, we could, or we could mix half of the steel with half silicon, so we're only using half of the amount of steel, and whether or not that's good or bad is kind of up to you and up to your logic that you use for the factory. In steel's case, it is good because 4 iron go into a steel, but only 1 silicon goes into a silicon. So usually in the case of steel, it's better to mix it with everything that you have, but it's not always the case. Like we can look at the iron here as a comparison. So iron, you can also mix in silicon, but it's more of a 1-to-1 ratio there. You can mix in manganese, you can mix in nickel and cobalt. So it kind of shows you how many different options you have. So kind of like before, instead of figuring out which option is best, I prefer to have every option available and then let the logic of the factory and the status of these warehouses determine which resource gets used. So if we're overloaded on, say, nickel, then a method that uses nickel, even if it's optional, is a really good idea, because then that will get rid of our extra nickel. So that's kind of how all that works. And it extends down here. This stuff hasn't been compacted into this bus yet, because with our new science tier, we'll be able to make better versions of these, which will be much more compact and will fit better with everything else we have going here. So that's why I kind of just put that stuff off for now. And it's kind of interesting that the factory is kind of split in half, where this is the old factory, pre-trains. And then once we got trains, everything got expanded up to here. But really, the stuff up top here consumes resources, doesn't really make them. So where to go from here? Well, we've been talking about making resources, or metals. Well, the other half of this is stone processing, which in itself is quite significant. And you kind of want to handle it well, because stone is quite valuable in Angel Bobs, especially if you have AAI Industries installed, when it uses a ton of bricks for everything. Ultimately, the destination for crushed stone is down here. And it's full by design. It's kind of weird, but it's full by design. And one thing you can do with it is turn it into the mineral sludge, which is a useful resource. The other thing is you can turn crushed stone into regular stone, and then that regular stone can be turned into landfill or bricks as you see fit. But there's logic connected here, so basically anytime we're overloaded on stone, we turn on methods that dump it, and this is one of them. It makes the mineral sludge. And we have our crystallizers down here, where anytime we have too much mineral sludge, it gets pumped down here and pumped into all of these machines. and they crystallize the ores from that mineral sludge. And you have a lot of different options, but you have to make them in these pairs. You can't just pick one you want to make. So if you want to make gold, you have to make nickel too. And it's a little randomized. And it says waiting output to clear there, because we have a set of logic, and I think I have 1 or 2 episodes dedicated to how this works, but basically it just looks to see which resource do we need the most of that we actually can produce right now. And then whatever that one is, if you look on here, it's sending the recipe to turn on or off, which is basically allowing this one set of machines to use any given recipe using the crafting combinator mod. And it's kind of flickering between those two because they're kind of tied for which one is most desirable. So that's why it's actually kind of making 4 resources at the same time. And that's fine. It's working as intended, basically. And these setups process their own wastewater. The reason why our factory doesn't have a repository for wastewater is because the numbers would be insane if we had that. So the wastewater is processed on site, and then the only thing we actually have to move are like the sulfur or maybe the mineralized water. So if you look at this, where 100 sulfuric wastewater goes in, well, then only 20 mineralized water would come out. So if we're going to bus something, busing the mineralized water is much more efficient than busing the sulfuric water. This setup over here is basically a geode generator, where it just generates geodes and then crushes them for the purposes of making this geode powder if they're needed for something. And it's not running right now, but I will explain that in a bit. And also we have an input of stone, which can come from these crushers, because you can crush slag down into stone. But slag is more valuable than stone, so you don't really want to crush it like that unless you have to. And you can see what an immense amount of slag is coming up here. And you might think, oh, look at all the slag the bus is making. It's not coming from the bus. It's coming from the electrolyzers that are making our oxygen, and I think this is kind of an outdated way of doing this because of just everything, all of the inputs, all of the outputs, but man, does it create slag. And I imagine, from what I understand of watching people play C-Block, so any of you C-Block lovers out there are probably like, oh yeah, this is totally normal, let's electrolyze a bunch of wastewater and make slag. But to me, that seems crazy. We're not doing it for the slag, but it's a huge method of making it, so I kind of don't want to turn it off. But it goes in here, and then the slag from the ore bus, and that's kind of shows you the comparison, comes in here. And anytime it gets overloaded, it dumps it into a setup which looks very similar to the stone setup. But basically, it's just turning all of this into the mineral sludge. And it has logic because sometimes we need the mineral sludge and sometimes it's a dump. So both of those processing setups put the mineral sludge into this storage tank here, and then what happens to it is just based on its level. Whenever it gets too high, it gets pumped to be crystallized away on the crystallizers from earlier. But it's also used to make these crystal catalysts, and those crystal catalysts are what are required for the different setups. I call them direct ore sorting, but basically where instead of sorting, let's say, sapphirite and you get slag, iron, and copper, you can get iron directly by mixing crushed sapphirite, crushed drivelite, and the mineral catalyst, and then get nothing as a result, at least as far as byproducts are concerned. So this is a cleaner way of doing things, but you can kind of see all of the things in your factory that have to go right to have mineral sludge available to make these. So that's why I have all these different setups, and also they are controlled with the same priority logic as the ores are, because they have their own little warehouses. Also, this is kind of like our acid bus, but all of the acid byproducts, after being processed away so we don't have to send them on pipes, are coming down on this bus, and that will be part of acid processing. We used to send the geodes here to get crushed. We don't any longer, but nonetheless these are other sources of crystal dust if necessary. But then this setup will run to create the crystal slurry that we need for various things. Mainly, we use them to make the crystal catalysts, which are also part of the ore sorting. There is another side setup here that can take crystal slurry and break it down into mineral sludge. And you can see it's going, because we can't really do anything with crystal slurry if we have too much, and mineral sludge is actually quite valuable. So you definitely want to process it down if you can, because once you get mineral sludge, you can get free ore out of it, and not just free ore. You decide which ore it is. Now, it has to be a combination of ores, so you can't just pick one, but that's free ore, and all this ore is stuff that our factory has a hard time making right now, so it's a good deal. And I definitely love trying to close loop everything, so I always try to do that and not waste anything. You totally could just clarify it away, I suppose, if you don't want to deal with it, but you probably don't want to do it that way. And that's most of that when it comes to stone processing. The stone products do continue because we need to make these concrete bricks and reinforced concrete bricks for various buildings. And we have our concrete set up here and refined concrete and many places for bots to park, because we've been using refined concrete as an excuse to perfectly cover the base with robots. And it's an awful lot of these little zone expanders everywhere, and still got ways to go, but we're getting there, slowly covering the factory. Don't really need it. The character already runs pretty fast. I don't have any speed increasing things on the character because the quality of life research mod allows you to upgrade your character. So like you can upgrade your character's crafting speed if you want to. And certainly I've spent the time to upgrade movement speed, so the character basically runs as if they have a bunch of power armor items when they really don't. But that's the setup to make all of those bricks in concrete. There are higher tiers of making bricks as well, so you see how to make concrete we're sending in silicon and iron, alumina, and lime, so it's a lot going in. So as a result, it really doesn't need that much stone, so we can make 120 concrete from only 3 pieces of stone. So it's definitely quite useful there. And then beyond, I think that's it for stone processing. Now we're in basically acid processing. Yeah, that's our electrolyzer setup. It's there to primarily generate oxygen, but it's not very good at that because it creates so many byproducts. It creates a ton of hydrogen, which are getting burned away here whenever the level gets too high. And the reason why it's difficult is just because of pipe limitations, where you can only get so much out of a pipe. And they had to be split like this because each one of these was maxing out a pipe, so it's kind of crazy. But it's in very close proximity to the acid setup because that's where most of the oxygen goes. So here is our sulfur warehouse, and this is the sulfuric acid setup, where it makes the sulfur dioxide gas, but it doesn't fill it up all the way because other processes in the factory make sulfur dioxide gas. So it only fills these up when they get too low, and it will dump them if the gas gets too high, but I don't think that generally happens. And then this setup here makes the sulfuric acid, and it gets sent on its way to wherever it needs to be in the factory. And scattered across the factory are these little clarifier setups because the factory is limited on how much of anything can go on a pipe. So the way that it gets around that is by having these setups to clarify extras kind of peppered around the factory. And we have a setup making explosives right here as well. And then up here we are making the nitric acid. This is the way that generates it from nothing but the air. And over here we are using acid byproducts, if we had any, which we don't, to make it from that. And this is a setup to burn rocket fuel, basically. But I don't think we really ever ran it. But if we were overloaded on rocket fuel, that's what would run. This is a simple setup right here for the hydrofluoric acid. You can see the fluorite going in there. And up here is the rocket fuel setup. Making these rocket boosters is what we use to fly around with, and it's our current best fuel for our trains. This processes the acid gas, and since it processes it in such small quantities, it just gets sent in when it needs to. And it looks like all 5 drones are busy and at work there. And then the only thing that's left over is the salt, which gets sent to chlorine processing, which in itself is kind of its own setup. So that's why the salt isn't being processed here. We have some LTN train stations there. And then down here is our sulfur generator, where we're actually using puffers. And I'll show the puffer setup later, but we are sending puffers down here because it doesn't take that many puffers to start this process. And basically, you do have to put in some resources, like you have to put in sulfuric wastewater, but you get more sulfur out of it by puffing than you would if you just processed it with a single hydro plant. So this giant setup here is all of the stuff that's necessary for puffers to puff. And then that's all of that down there. We're starting to get into old factory up here. This setup here makes the gemstones, which are used in very specific things. Right now we don't really need it for too much, but nonetheless it's here. It basically uses crystal stuff, so it uses crystal seedling, and it uses these catalysts, and then you can basically just pick the gemstone you want and send it through its various tiers of processing and polishing until you're left with the polished versions, and then they're here to be sent to where they need to go. I think we're only really using rubies right now. And there's a setup right here to make the grinding wheels, which are a component of this. This is our paper setup that in the beginning, to make the tier 1 circuits, I believe you have to use like stone. And it's better to use paper. And there's many different ways of doing it. You can just grow trees and then turn them into circuit boards, but if you go down the paper route first, it's a lot more efficient for your trees. So that's what all of this is doing, is just basically making paper. You go all the way to the top, and it's an algae product. So green algae uses carbon dioxide and some of that mineralized water, which is a very useful byproduct that the factory has. It grows the algae, and then the algae is turned into these fibers, which are then being turned into the paper. So actually in this particular situation, it's not using any trees at all. It could, but since this is an infinite way of doing it, it's probably better to do this than use the trees for it, and that's kind of why I did that. These are more algae generators. Most of them are making methanol gas, which is used in plastic, but some of them are running to make some chemicals here, which are going into making resin. And then that resin is a component in the white circuit boards, or the tier 2 circuit boards. So this is tier 1 and this is tier 2. And you could make resin from trees too, but it's much more efficient to do it this way. Right here is making nitroglycerin, which goes into cordite, which goes into our ammo. And then right here, this is making fertilizer using just chemicals. So you don't have to put any compost or anything into it. It just gets urea, ammonia, and nitric acid, and you get fertilized compost as a result. And that does it, I think, for most of the processes here, so we'll keep moving forwards. We are making plastic using the rest of these algae machines. And it works the same way, where it just grows the algae turns into the cellulose, and then that cellulose is getting converted into methanol, which goes through these steam crackers to get turned into propene, and then propene can get made into plastic. So all of our factory's output of plastic right now is actually coming from mineralized water. It's not coming from mining any oil at all. So that's quite interesting. And here are some setups to turn those into pellets, basically for the purposes of making fuel and carbon products. And that will be explained later, but there's logic connected to this. That's why it's not running. Because mineralized water is a byproduct we can't directly control. We can, because you can dump stone into it, and we do have a setup to do that. It is kind of a component of another setup, but it's right here. These machines right here are making mineralized water if it gets low. But this is dependent on a lot of different setups, but it's worked since the beginning, so we haven't had to change it, surprisingly. So this is one of the older parts of the factory. Not the oldest part, I don't think, but now we're basically in our power generation, where our factory does have solar panels. In fact, it has a lot of solar panels. And it has accumulators. And in fact, it has a lot of accumulators. Part of the reason is because I'm using the longer nights with the day-night extender mod, and as a result, the nights are 4 times as long as they would normally be. Well, I should say the 24-hour periods are 4 times as long, but nights in vanilla Factorio are actually incredibly short. That only about 10% of the time is actually pitch black night. Most of the time is the sun going up or down. So by making it realistic where half of the day is night, you actually need a huge amount of accumulators, and this is actually relevant to real life when it comes to like solar and wind power. Well, a huge problem of that is where to put the power and store it for a rainy day, basically. And batteries, like that hold electricity, are not a good idea for that because of how big and how expensive they are. So you kind of see that in practice in this factory with how many accumulators there are. In real life, they would use like a hydroelectric dam or something like that would be a much better way of storing electricity for another day. You would just store it using water. Can't do that in Factorio though, so we have to use our accumulators. But even still, with all of this power generation and all of these other setups, like this setup right here, burns any extra propane that we don't need for making plastic. And this setup over here burns all that extra hydrogen we don't need from all this electrolyzing. Even still, our factory needs a ton of power. So the way that we're doing it currently is by growing beans, essentially, where we chose to use Benefran, and the reason is because it requires saline water, and our factory has basically been wasting saline water and dumping it since the very beginning. So this is a great resource to turn into, let's call it factory food. Humans eat beans, factories eat electricity. But that's a great use of saline because we're essentially turning saline water into power. And it's going through all of these farms to make the Benefran, and then that Benefran goes through processing to get turned into beans. The beans are pressed into vegetable oil, and then that vegetable oil is filtered into nutrient pulp. Can't really see it because we're actually out of it. Into regular vegetable oil. I wonder why these aren't running. Looks like the nutrient pulp is overloaded. Because fuel oil is overloaded. Because it's not connected. Now I'm actually recording this after the fact, so I probably fixed this in another episode already. But it will be released after this episode. Oh, and their research stopped. So, you'll probably see me figure that out a second time at some point. But at least we can see all this running now, because it'd be kind of weird to explain how something works and all the machines are broken. And you'll be like, oh, it works fine, trust me, it works. I know it's all broken right now, but trust me, it works. Like, that's not the Factorio way. The Factorio way is showing you everything running. So, it is filtering the oil, and then processing that oil between mostly fuel oil, but also some base mineral oil. The nutrient pulp can itself be processed into more fuel oil, and some of it turns into glycerol. And other nutrient pulp is sent on its way to other processes that can use it, because this is kind of a dump. This is a last resort. The reason being is that the glycerol will get destroyed because we can't burn it for fuel, and we only need so much of it. It's basically used for making ammunition. So beyond that, we just have to get rid of it. And this is where we store the fuel oil and mineral oil. We're basically controlled by fuel oil because we make way more mineral oil than we need. But nonetheless, we have a method of making it. That would be down here where we have a fish growing setup, which I will show later, which will press the fish into mush, and then that mush will get filtered into our mineral oil. So in the event that we run low on mineral oil, this will run. But most of the time it doesn't need to, because we're usually dumping the mineral oil anyway, because we're making so much fuel oil, basically for power. And that power comes from down here, where this uses the residual gas to make lubricant, and this will use the residual gas to make liquid fuel. And then those liquid fuels are made into these enriched fuel blocks. And enriched fuel blocks are a fantastic fuel because they hold 50 megajoules for every single one of them. And it has reduced fuel pollution compared to other methods. So it's just a good way of making fuel. It's relatively clean, I should say, for what it is. Usually we have to dump this residual gas because we don't always need it. But in the event we do need more residual gas, we are dumping some of these oil residuals, which we have hundreds of thousands of from back in the day of doing the Mad Clown's ores processing of oil sands. And just like a few episodes of that, and we got like 500,000 oil residuals. So we have yet to actually use it all up, which shows you how unbalanced all that was. Maybe for the end game, Mad Clowns is a lot better, but at no point prior to that is it any good because you just get so overloaded on stuff. And I think I talked about this here. This is the setup that will burn propane. So in the event that we don't need that plastic, but we do have the mineral water, then we can turn the mineral water going through this large process right here to turn it into propane, and then the propane's just burned for fuel. So it's just another method of making fuel. And since we are talking about fuel, I suppose we can walk that direction. Right here is just a brown algae setup. It runs on saline water, and the only purpose of it is to make this alginic acid for other processes. But all of this right here is our power generation setup for fuel blocks that they get sent in as required, and because that was all messed up, we're actually about to completely run out of power here. But the blocks are just about to get here, so it won't be too bad. Not to mention, of course, we have accumulator power too, so all of that works together to create a nice buffer. And we have quite a bit of power. I think we have several gigawatts in total if every one of these was running. And some of them are running on wood blocks as well. But most of this is for all of those enriched fuel blocks there. Now we're going to old factory. A lot of this is empty because we never really expanded out this far, but this is our warehouse array here for storing extra resources that just has nowhere to go in the factory. And you can see we have our 400,000 oil residuals and also 54K of tungsten, just because we can't process tungsten right now without doing the research. We just unlocked the ability to do that research. So this is where everything goes and we have nowhere else to send it. And now we are approaching what is probably the oldest part of the factory. That I think it's pretty early. I think this tree setup was built on like episode 24 or something like that. Like that's how old this part is. But it works just fine. It grows trees. So we have a setup for generating mud, and this is actually the mud generator of the factory. Even though other setups can generate mud, this is the primary way of doing it if it's needed. You mix in compost to make soil, and then that soil can make the seeds, and you send the seeds and more soil in to make trees, and they're kind of funny looking, but you see the green trees there, and then they get picked up by these assembling machines, and it uses saw blades to chop the wood into the regular wood that we're used to. And there's higher tiers of these tree makings that I've just never really done because we've never needed to upgrade this setup, but you can upgrade it to have higher levels of efficiency. And we have upgraded part of it where normally you would just use regular saw blades, but you can make these crystal tipped saw blades so the blades last longer before they need to be replaced. And that wood gets sent to where it needs to go, but also it makes these wood pellets here, which are also being sent other places. I kind of wonder what kind of numbers do a lot of these parts of the factory have. Well, it does show you where most of these machines have made about 20,000 recipes, and each recipe makes 4 trees, and each tree gets chopped into 6 to 8 wood. So an enormous amount of wood has come out of this setup over the past 300 episodes. And down here is a slightly newer but still very old factory setup. This is making the clay bricks. So the tiers of the bricks are regular bricks, stone bricks, which is tier 1, the clay bricks, which is tier 2, the concrete bricks, which is tier 3, and then the reinforced concrete bricks I showed earlier are the tier 4 of bricks. But basically it just requires a bunch of water products, and they all get mixed together to make the bricks, and then the bricks have to be fired. And this only runs when drones come to pick them up, and since they stack in units of 1,000, it doesn't run very often. And down here is just the sapphirite mine. So nothing to see there. And that covers most of the old factory. So now as we come up here, we're going to start covering new factory stuff. I mean, it's all relative, I suppose. Hopefully this episode will be interesting, and I just worry that a factory tour type of episode might be boring for long-time viewers of the channel. But then again, even I myself can forget what a lot of this stuff is, so perhaps it would actually be quite interesting to get a review on the state of the factory. This right here is a pretty fresh setup. It is the lithium product setup, so the cobalt goes in if it was available, and because we're so short on cobalt, we actually had to unhook this, so it's not running. But basically, it goes through the processes necessary to make lithium-ion batteries. And it's right next door to our chlorine processing setup, which is pretty big here. And because it's water limited, these are all their own little setup because they're limited by the speed of a pipe. And basically, we just have these salination plants, which take a pipe of water, turn it into saline water, and then that saline water is electrolyzed. And our factory does have more than enough saline water, but when these actually run, even the factory couldn't keep up with it. And because it generates so much hydrogen, it needs its own independent hydrogen burners as well. And it usually just dumps the chlorine, because the whole purpose of it doing this is to make sodium hydroxide, which is being stored over here. But this system here also processes other chlorine items. Like you see, we got a delivery of salt here. And then the salt comes in. It can be used in two different setups, and they have priority based on which one would run, and it looks like they're both running because they both want to. The one on the bottom here makes hydrochloric acid, so it runs when hydrochloric acid is low. But that isn't always the case, so in the event that it's not low, it needs to have somewhere else for it to go. And in the event, it would go up here, and you can basically turn salt into sodium hydroxide, and that's what it's doing. And here's another method of making hydrogen chloride if we need to. This method down here makes glycerol if we need it. And that's basically how that works. Up here is a setup that actually processes thermal water, so red algae is grown from thermal water, and we are making this calcium carbonate, which is then going into making this alien goo. And the alien goo is made from spores, which comes from polluted fish water, which will come from above. Then over here is where the byproducts from making the Science Cost Tweaker science packs go. And they get turned into ores, which is slowly sent to the bus. And this is one of our pipe buses, basically, for various liquids. Over here is carbon processing, or coal processing, however you want to look at it. Where we have a coal mine here, dumping coal in. And then it gets turned into crushed coal and then coke, which gets stored here and sent to where it needs to. Because the various methods of processing these different ores use the different types of coal products. So we needed to make a bunch of it for that purpose. And also, it will make carbon as well over here. And that's the way using coal, but it's also possible to do it infinitely using natural resources. So from down here comes the byproducts of green algae, if they are available. And from over here comes the pellets from the tree processing. And if they are available, they will be turned into fuel blocks, which, for what they're worth, are a pretty efficient way of making power, where it's 20 megajoules for a single wood block, so it's reasonably dense. And it comes from trees, so it's basically infinite. But you can also make carbon dioxide from those, and you can turn it into charcoal, and then turn it into carbon. And that's why it goes up there. And it's all empty because this only runs if the byproduct is available. And if it's not available, then it just makes it from coal the normal way. And that's how it's running here. And if it needs to make carbon dioxide from just straight up coal, it can do that there. And that's that. I think that covers basically the lower half of the factory. And that's probably the complicated part. Up here, it's probably a lot simpler. Let's go to the production side first of the northern factory. And most of this up here is for the purposes of making basically modules. Like, all of this is making crystals for modules. So if you want modules, you're gonna have to spend a lot of time. So all of this runs right here. Well, it makes saline water if necessary, but essentially it's basically making fish food, where we are making these Nexaflax, and Nexaflax basically only makes leaves, which is kind of like the worst food type. As you would imagine, leaves are not very nutritious, and crystal dust. The crystal dust is being sent down to be used if possible, but the main purpose of this is to make fish food, which gets turned into the nutrient pulp. And it doesn't need to run right now because it's not actually low on nutrient pulp. And all of these setups here make the fish water from the saline water. And up here is the fish breeder. And we are growing the Santa rays. So they call it fish petting, but as the fish do their thing and pollute the fish water, they slowly die off and they need to be replaced. So that is what this part is here for, just to replace them. And to make them, they require eating raw meat. It tastes just like chicken. And the raw meat is made from more of their brethren. So every once in a while when we need meat, we just pick up one, chop it up into meat, and put it down the system. And any other fish we might find in our inventory also gets sent to these butcheries here to get chopped up into fish food. And then this huge aquarium, all of this is to make the polluted fish water. And then there's an additional setup on the side here that is growing Factorio fish. It creates polluted fish water as a result. These are not here for the fish water, they're here to make the Factorio fish. And those fish are being sent all the way down to our fuel setup right here to be smushed into mineral oil if our mineral oil is low. This tiny setup right here is making the cellulose paste, which is necessary for making those crystals. This right here is a giant setup that's only purpose is to make mud, which goes into making these landfills. Because when you need landfill, you need a lot of it. Like a lot of it. So this huge setup was built just to generate landfill very quickly. This setup right here gets its own little bus, but this is another puffer setup, but unlike the other one where the puffers were there to generate sulfur, these puffers are here to grow because we are breeding puffers where puffers go in and then puffers come out, but they leave eggs. And then those eggs get hatched into new puffers. But we don't care about the puffers, we're here for the eggs because you're left over with the eggshell remains, which are being sent on their way. The actual puffers themselves are kind of just a byproduct of doing this. So it runs as long as it has to either keep the puffer count healthy or to keep the eggshells up. And this stuff over here is basically just making puffer food. And over here, in the event we have too many puffers but not enough shells, well, sorry puffers, but you're getting chopped up into fish food. And that's what happens here. They get chopped up into meat, and then that meat gets sent back to the aquarium for whenever we need more fish. And there is a separate setup for the 6 different colors of puffers. For the purposes of making the eggshells, it doesn't really matter. They're all about the same. But they do have slightly different input requirements, so that's why we have all 6, just in case we might actually want all 6 for something. And here's more puffer atmosphere setups. All of that is there just to make sure the puffers can breathe properly. So, the purpose of making all these puffers and polluted fish water is to make the crystals, which go into making the modules. Right here is a giant setup. Clearly we did not have modules when we built this, because we were trying to get to that. But all of these are here to make silicon carbide. And up here, we are making petri dishes, which get the alien bacteria mixed in. I see some crystal catalyst, and then it gets turned into these crystal seeds, which make more crystals for our polluted fish water. So they go through these crystallizers, the fish water goes in, those seeds go in, and then it gets turned into the raw splinters. The splinters get chopped up into their individual colors, and they go down here, and in the event that any particular color is overloaded, they can get chopped up and ground up and put back into the system. Also, in the event we get overloaded on fish water, which did happen in the past, we can waste the fish water by turning them into crystals and then turning that crystals back into powder to make the fish water disappear, because for whatever reason, it can't be directly clarified. You have to go through some process to make it disappear. And to make the harmonic splinters, you have to combine the other colors. And some of it's going to drones, and the rest of it's going to trains. And then that's the tier 1 of crystals. There's basically 3 tiers of crystals. And the tier 2 is over here, where we have this set up, which requires that we add in all of those eggshells that we were making to make these eggshell seeds. And then they get mixed in. They turn into the crystals. The crystals have to get chopped up. And if you have too many, they're ground, just like before. Then they have to be polished, and the harmonic version has to be made. But that's how we get all of those crystals. And that should cover most of the raw resource production. There is one more out here. This is our garden generator. It doesn't really run much, but when doing certain research or making certain things, you need this alien plant life sample. And you have no hope of finding that just by finding these gardens on the map. So you have to grow the gardens. And this was a setup to grow the 3 different garden types. And the reason why we have so much here is because you get the seeds for the different types of things you want to grow from these different gardens. So this setup was built to basically generate the plant life samples, but also the individual seeds for each type of thing we might want to grow. And now that we have a minimum amount of seeds for each item, the setup doesn't need to run anymore. So now we can quickly cover the buses. Luckily, they're pretty simple. I don't have to go through every single thing on the bus. I think most people watching this would know how a bus works. Resources go in, you turn them into things. Resources go out. But we do have different buses for different things to keep them from getting too complicated. So this is our intermediates bus. It uses resources that are uncommon and only used for very limited things, just to keep the main bus from getting too complicated, basically. So it's using things like gunmetal, explosives, cordite, batteries going both in and out, ammunition. This is all stuff that doesn't really need to be on a main bus. So it's not. It's off here to the side. And also it gets pretty big, as you see. So it was put here just to keep the main bus a little cleaner. And we can kind of fly over the main bus here. It's simply called that because this is the destination of most resources. So the purpose of the main bus is to basically build the machines that we need. So, you know, belts, assemblers, all of the production machines, but not things like modules, not things like electronics. That's separate. This right here is basically just a giant bot setup because so many resources go into this that it's probably just easier to have bots making requests for this stuff. So it's pulled off of the bus, put in these provider chests here, then bots just move them to where they need to go. And if they can be direct inserted, they are. Other setups don't operate that way. Ones that use a great deal of resources. And also we built some of this stuff before we had bots, so that wasn't really an option at the time. But for something like inserters that you make thousands and thousands of them, having bots just moving back and forth right here is kind of excessive. So this was done with belts just to make it easier on the bots. It's probably worth mentioning our junk repository, which is this storage warehouse here, that any resources that cannot go anywhere else in the base go here. And it's basically our warning for, hey, something's wrong. And all these brass wheels here are here simply because the other warehouse where they would go are full. So they have nowhere else to go. And this is our reverse factory for junk that we don't need anymore. It can get turned back into resources, and I have it set to be 100% efficient. Some people might consider that unrealistic, but it's not like we're generating resources, so I don't really have a problem with, for example, taking our plastic pipes and getting all of the plastic back from it. I don't feel the need to like make it 80% or 50% or something like that. I'll just make it 100 and get all the resources back. So that's what this little setup here is, and this tends to be where I kind of stand to my character, because there's a teleporter pad here, and there's a charge pad here, so this is kind of a great place just to chill out. But here's where all the robots are made, and right here is where all the roboports and charge pads and stuff are made. But a main bus is a main bus. You know, there's one belt of each item for the most part, and these are actually separate items because we use coils as much as possible, which means that, for example, one coil is 4 times as dense as a plate for aluminum, so one belt of aluminum coils is actually 4 belts of aluminum plates. So what we really have here are 4 belts of iron, 4 belts of copper, 4 belts of tin, 4 belts of tinned copper wire, 4 belts of aluminum, 4 belts of silver, 4 belts of steel, and these aren't in coil form, but you kind of get the idea of how dense coils are, so that's why you should always use them if you can. We have 2 more buses to cover here. Despite as big as the main bus is, it's not actually the factory's biggest bus. That award goes to the circuits bus, and the reason why the circuits bus is its own bus is just because of how insanely big it gets, because of how many circuits you need. How big is the circuits bus? It's this. And it was so big it had to split and do a U-turn of shame. So if you put it on the end here, it would basically be starting at this wall and go almost to this wall on the other side, to give you an idea of how huge it is. And it's its own bus just because circuits use a very specific set of resources, so it's pretty efficient to put all the circuit stuff on their own bus. Plus it uses things like crystals as well. So the circuits bus is its own thing, number 1 for size, but also 2 just to keep less resources. So for example, all of these crystals don't have to be on our main bus now because we're processing them elsewhere. But it would be too much to cover, and I can't even really zoom out to show you. But, it makes the various tiers of electronics, like we're making our white circuits there. And then this right here is making our tier 2 of modules. So we had to make the module main boards, and then those go in with a combination of all these other things, where first it's making tier 1, and then they get direct inserted into tier 2, and then those get put on drones to be taken where they need to go. And modules have their own research labs here that use module components. So it's kind of weird how that works, but basically just generic module components are used to research better modules, not the modules themselves. And then the top half of the setup here is our green circuit setups, which are here. And also the tier 5 modules. So you see how we have the tier 3s, which use all of this, which get direct inserted into tier 4, which gets direct inserted into tier 5, and tier 5 does require rubies. So that's why they're delivered here. So when you look at the setups, this whole square right here is just for the blue modules. This square right here is just for the yellow ones. And then, of course, we've got our productivities and also the pollution cleanings right here. And this tiny little setup here is making the lower tiers of pollution cleaning, which shows you the power of modules, where when we built these, we didn't have access to modules in the beginning, so this is how big a setup is to make tier 2 modules. And then when we did have modules, the tier 5 modules, this is how big it was. So it was much smaller. Also, another reason that the electronics bus is its own thing and why it's so huge is because electronic components go into making electronics themselves. And the problem with electronic components is they are less dense than the resources that go in. So for example, let's say you put 30 resources in, you'll get 60, as an example, of electronic components coming out. So in other words, if you bus them, they would take up more space than the resources that went in, which means that it's just very logistically complicated. So as a result, none of them are bust. That anytime we need any kind of electronic components for something, they are made right on site next to the thing that needs them. And finally, we have our last bus to cover, one we have been working on very recently, and it's the science bus. It does use a lot of similar components to the rest of the factory, but nonetheless, it is unique enough and large enough in size. It does have a turn of shame here, but it's unique enough to where it would have cluttered the main bus to have it on there. So I split it apart. But not too much to talk about. The early tiers of making science is really simple with Science Cost Tweaker, and then they get more and more complicated. So there's our red and green science, and then all of this right here is to make blue. And up here, all of this makes the military science. And this is something we covered a few days ago, but this is our setup to make alien research using the various alien orbs. And this is the gold science packs, which are basically just a combination of red, green, blue, and military packs. And following the bus down through our giant turn of shame here because I didn't position it properly, we have our very phallically shaped pink setup, and also kind of phallically shaped purple setup as well. And they're a lot smaller, surprisingly, due to the power of speed modules and efficiency modules, and just having faster machines. I was thinking those setups were going to be huge, but they're actually smaller than the setups that we built before. And then on the bottom here is basically chemical processing related to these. So unfortunately, to do a lot of the Science Cost Tweaker stuff, you need to do some amount of oil processing. And actually, as you've noticed, their factory doesn't have an oil processing setup somewhere. That for the most part, the factory has handled its oil just through natural processes. But to do this, we had to actually mine it. So that's kind of what this setup is here, where it's basically mining for naphtha. We have a little bit of extra fuel oil, and it's handling oxygen, nitrogen. And this setup here is processing to make rubber. And rubber is basically made from natural gas products. And then it's being stored and sent on its way. Luckily, rubber, even though it looks like we're not making much of it, it's used in extremely small quantities when you are using it. So you don't really need very much of it. Because I think one piece of rubber can make like 60 coated wires or something like that. So you need very little of it. And then on the end here is if any of these gases get overloaded, it just gets burnt away. And I believe that concludes the factory tour. I can definitely see the value of doing a video like this just to both show newcomers all of the parts of the factory they may not have seen, but also for the existing viewers, it's just kind of a review of things that were done very long ago that can be quite hard to remember. And even if you binge watched 300 episodes, good luck. Like, I'm sure a couple of you who are watching this episode have recently finished binge watching a lot of episodes. So here's my question to you. Feel free to comment. Did you remember the episode that had anything to do with this tree setup? I'm guessing you don't, even if you binged watched them, because it was probably still quite a long time ago when this setup was built. You probably remember that it exists, but do you actually remember what all of this stuff does? Or are you like me where you're looking at it, it's moving, so you're like, well, it must be fine because trees are coming out of it. Because that's how I look at this setup. I have to trust myself that Marsh from the past did this properly. So this is kind of why I try so hard to do things right the first time, because I know that a setup can exist for a very long time and I am not going to remember how or why I did it that way. So I need to have the self-confidence in myself that I did it properly and to not second guess every little thing that I've done. Because otherwise you'll never move forward in Factorio if you're constantly second guessing every build and trying to make every build better. The factory doesn't get this big if you're constantly rebuilding things. So that is my advice to do your best to build things properly, and if it works and it's not causing your factory problems, don't mess with it. Just move on and grow the factory, because that is what Factorio is all about. But that does it for this episode. So thanks for watching, and with the next episode, we will get back to expanding the factory. See you later.